I'm Ruth. I'm here to introduce our next presentation, which is Associate Professor Laura Gray and Associate Professor Joe Tai from Deakin University. They're going to be talking about attending to neurodivergent identity, universal design, and professional identity formation. A reminder to please put your questions into Slido. Thank you. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you so much. Hi, so my name's Laura. I use she, her pronouns, and my visual description is a middle-aged Caucasian woman with long blonde hair. Today I'm wearing white. And I'm presenting today on behalf of a larger group of people who've contributed to this work, most notably Joe Tai, who's also here online, and who will hopefully be able to jump into the discussion. But I'd like to start just by saying how much I appreciate being able to join you remotely. This has really been a wonderful example of a very accessible event, as befits the subject matter. I also feel very privileged to follow on from all of the excellent presenters and the fabulous and very insightful discussions that have been going on today. So I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm dialing in today from Wadawurrung country, and the image on screen is a photo looking out over the ocean from on top of the bluff near where I live. And I'd like to acknowledge the really long history of sharing knowledge and caring for communities as well as country. So I wanted to start today by sharing a couple of quotes from neurodivergent graduates of health professions programs, which illustrate the really central idea that I'd like to talk about today. This idea that we need to pay attention to the identity of our students, the identities that they bring to their studies, the identities that they shape through the course of their learning, and then the tensions that can arise when students don't feel that their identities align with the identities that we're asking them to develop in our courses. We heard students describe it as being unprofessional to be themselves and feeling like they couldn't be authentic if they wanted to graduate. So why identity? And how does it relate to universal design for learning? So UDL, as we currently understand it, UDL 3.0, emphasises that need to recognise learner identities in order to best meet their learning needs. However, our data and much of the narrative in the literature suggests that identities aren't actually fixed. They're shaped by the experiences of students, the courses that they undertake, and the environments in which they're learning. And this can be framed as a constructivist, or actually a critical constructivist framework of self-authorship, through which we can see that structures of power and relationality shape all of us and the way that we understand ourselves in relation to the world around us. So we need to take into account the way that identity is shaped by learning experiences and learning environments. So the fact that it's not a static entity, but something that's built and adapted over time, both consciously and unconsciously. And the literature also illustrates the way that identity, which relates really strongly to ideas of belonging, is really intrinsic to the ways that students engage with learning. So we need to attend to identity in order to tailor our teaching and our assessment to our students' needs, to build belonging and engagement, as well as safety. But it's also important to recognise that we're not just responding to students' identities, we're shaping identities and asking our students to reshape their identities through their studies. And this isn't just a theoretical or somehow airy-fairy kind of concept. We actually ask our learners to take on the identity of a student or a graduate or a professional. And we sometimes call this professional identity formation. And we ask our learners to enact or perform these identities. We ask them to behave in a professional manner. And our assessment criteria or our learning objectives often specifically reference professionalism. The cultures of our programs also reinforce these identities. And this is common in many disciplines, but very strong in areas like health, where there are often quite explicit requirements that graduates of nursing or OT or medicine programs are able to act as health professionals and to take on that identity as a health professional. And this is important as members of that professional group do need to be able to embody the values of the profession, just demonstrating the capabilities or adhering to appropriate ethical standards, for example. However, the challenge comes where that idea of what a professional is or a professional looks like extend beyond those capabilities or values or ethics and encompasses other identity attributes, sometimes in a way that isn't very clearly articulated and isn't always very comfortable for students who don't feel that their identities fit what's being asked of them. So what we know is that students are never just learners. They bring their identities and all of their complexities in their lives outside their studies with them. And we've heard quite a lot about that today. And there's quite an established story around the way that learners and people in general experience what can be referred to as identity dissonance, where the norms of the program or the environment or the society in which they are in don't align with their identity. And this can relate to race or ethnicity, gender, sexuality, physical attributes, or other aspects of identity that might be marginalised. And students who are marginalised in this way might feel pressured to conform or to adapt or to minimise or mask aspects of their own identity in order to belong or in order to achieve that perceived normative professional identity. So what I'll be describing today is some data that comes from a larger project exploring the experiences of neurodivergent graduates of health professions programs. As this audience is I'm sure very well aware, neurodivergence is an umbrella phenomenon that encompasses differing ways of thinking and being and behaving, including but not limited to things that can be identified through a formal diagnostic process, such as autism, dyslexia, ADHD. Our team of researchers comprises neurodivergent individuals, carers of neurodivergent children, as well as neurotypical individuals, all of whom work towards taking a neuro-affirming stance to our work, and also who hold a range of roles in higher education and clinical training. And we've run an extensive online survey, as well as a series of more in-depth interviews with graduates of a range of health professions programs, including nursing, med, physiotherapy, OT, several other courses. And what we heard were really complex stories of how these students navigated that process of establishing their identities, of reshaping these identities in response to the environment and the requirements of the course. One of the main themes that we identified was that it often took some time for students to identify that they were neurodivergent until well into or sometimes after their training. Sometimes it was the pressure of their studies that prompted them to seek a diagnosis, or sometimes they entered the course with a formal diagnosis, but it took some time to really understand what that meant. What was evident, though, that was when students didn't have a clear sense of their neurodivergent identity, it sometimes resulted in distress and confusion, with internalized blame and sometimes misdiagnosis or overlaid diagnoses of depression or anxiety. And sometimes students didn't feel like they had the knowledge or the support to change that situation. What we also heard was that students experienced their neurodivergent identities as sometimes being incompatible with their professional identities, that who they were or how they behaved didn't fit that idea of the professional. Students described having to mask or hide their neurodivergent identities. And when they didn't, they were chastised for being unprofessional, sometimes for what felt like really fairly arbitrary reasons, fidgeting in class, wearing sunglasses when the lights were too bright, and issues which weren't always tied to specific learning outcomes or assessments, but which arose from these ideas of what a professional identity should look like. Respondents also noted, and I'm guessing it won't come as a major surprise to this audience, that there were some limitations around formal accommodations processes. Students sometimes found accommodations useful, but there were challenges around accessing accommodations, sometimes because they needed a formal diagnosis or it felt unsafe to disclose, or it just took time and effort and energy to ask and ask again and push for accommodations to be implemented. And sometimes the accommodations just didn't fit the environment. We saw this particularly with regards to clinical placements, or the accommodations just didn't suit the needs of the students, like a Band-Aid solution. However, students also shared stories of how they built or reshaped their identity in a really positive, agentic way through their studies. They described the importance of really understanding yourself, understanding how your brain works, how you learn, what you need, and what environments work for you. And this really helped them feel resilient and compassionate towards themselves and empowered. Respondents also highlighted the significant impact of peer connection with other students, neurodivergent students, allies, and the impact of visible role models who successfully navigated that process of reconciling their neurodivergent identity and a professional identity in a way that was really positive and sustainable and empowering. So looking at this data, I think it's really compelling to think about the way that UDL can go beyond accessibility and adjusting teaching approaches to think about being intentional in the way that we interact with learners. I think it's helpful to pose a series of questions for educators or learning designers or course teams. And first of that being, can we create safe and inclusive environments which foster belonging and community for the diversity of student identities within our programs? And can we enable all of our learners to build those really critical self-awareness and reflective capabilities? Going further, can we provide explicit teaching on learning skills tailored to differing or neurodivergent ways of thinking? And really importantly, can we provide visibly diverse or divergent role models which show students the way that others have shaped or built a professional identity that aligns or works with their neurodivergent identity? So it's clear that building a sense of what it means to be a professional remains really important for students. But can we open up what those normative expectations are so that there are many different ways of being a professional? Or reconceptualizing professionalism as being centered around the values of the profession rather than conforming to an archetype of what a professional looks like? Students shouldn't have to choose between being professional and being themselves. And educators really have a role to play in questioning these assumptions and actively supporting students to navigate building their own sense of identity. Before we wind up and move to questions, I just wanted to come back again to the data, because those really important student voices again. The stories and responses that we heard really encourage us to think critically about the ways that our courses might constrain identity or make students feel like they didn't belong. And some of them made for really troubling reading. I found it really difficult to respond appropriately or to know how to respond to these kind of quite emotionally laden comments that we were hearing from our respondents. And that identity dissonance was a huge burden for students, who then often dedicated a lot of time and energy into masking instead of learning and engaging with their studies. And sometimes this went beyond neurodivergence. Other identity attributes can be marginalised or not valued or thought of as sufficiently professional. Experiences which really impacted students' sense of belonging, but also their feelings about whether they could succeed academically and progress in the course. Now, I realise I've covered quite a few points in this session, so I'd just like to recap with some takeaway messages to educators and really to any staff contributing to learning programs.
You've got 5 minutes, Laura.
Thank you. It might be self-evident and it's written into the UDL 3.0 guidelines, but we do need to recognise the diversity of student identities and all the things that they bring with them. Neurodiversity is one factor to consider, but of course there's many other factors that make up who students are and what their capabilities and learning needs might be. And in response to these identities, how can we build into curriculum opportunities for students to explore and reshape and develop those identities in a positive way that values what they bring, as well as the capabilities and values or ethics that they are supposed to develop and expected to develop in order to build that professional identity? And of course, to do that, they need to be afforded an environment that's safe, where we have critically examined the ways that normative expectations of who students need to be or what the ideal student looks like plays out in our program cultures. Is it safe for students to disclose? Do they have positive role models? Do we talk with respect and insight about what it means to be a student or a graduate or a professional? And importantly, how is this reflected in our curriculum? How do our learning objectives, our assessment rubrics, our progression rules, or our admission policies reflect all of these ideas? Ultimately, what we're aiming for, of course, are learning spaces where all students feel like they belong and are able to navigate forming and building those positive senses of themselves as they learn. So just before we go to questions, I'd like to acknowledge that this work wouldn't have been possible without the contributions of an absolutely fantastic and quite lovely team of people, including staff and students from a range of health professions programs and health services, as well as collaborators from the amazing Cradle team at Deakin. And of course, I've got to thank the respondents to our survey and the people who gave up their time to talk to me and share their really impactful stories. I hope that we can do their stories justice and work towards some positive change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was quite challenging to hear those disclosures from students, and quite, yeah, wow. There are a couple of questions. Please do add to them as we're going through them. I'm going to start off with, I'm starting off with one. There's that cultural fear amongst health students of the regulator, APRA, taking action if they do disclose their condition during training. How would we go about addressing that concern within a teaching setting?
That's such a good point. And it's one of those things that kind of lingers over health profession students, that idea that APRA is going to be monitoring them and jumping on them if they show any signs of frailty. And I think that it kind of speaks to some of those often unspoken narratives in health professions, that a health professional needs to be permanently healthy and well and able and capable and never have an external life. And it's just not realistic. And I don't think that's what APRA is trying to aim for either. APRA's intention is to ensure that patients are safe. And so I think there's this culture that's built up in health professions in particular that isn't actually very healthy. It doesn't allow health professionals to be human. And so we need to question that. And talking about it has a big impact. And part of that, those conversations need to be with students about the role of regulation and what APRA is actually expecting. And I'm not an expert in how APRA interpret the rules, but what I do know is that the intention isn't to catch people out. It's about identifying and supporting people who need a bit of extra assistance, rather than being a punitive process. It can be punitive if people are doing the wrong thing, but that's not the intention. And certainly from students' perspectives, there's a very high threshold for reporting. It's a whole other conversation that we probably don't want to get into too much, but it's a really important conversation to have with students early on to start to dismantle that culture.
That's really interesting. And I'm guessing that the work you're doing at Deakin will help to inform some of those conversations and the way that the bodies do perhaps adapt, hopefully adapt in the future. An interesting observation here, sort of question. Have you thought about getting stories from alumni who are neurodivergent, who are now practicing, to role model for students or share their stories?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of what we're trying to do with this study. So we've collected a lot of data from these graduates through the survey and then through these more in-depth interviews. And what we'd like to do is publish those stories and share those stories, because a large part of what we're seeing is the way that the respondents and then the participants have really grappled with some of these ideas, but then reshaped their own identities in a way that made sense to them, and reshaped their understanding of what professionalism means and what their role required of them in a way that was really, really agentic. You know, they were really developed that sense of empowerment and ability to advocate for their own needs, which was and that was based on really understanding their own needs. They kind of developed this great understanding of who they were and how they worked and how they studied and how they performed in a professional environment. And I think those stories were actually really empowering, as much as the stories of the struggles were troubling, deeply troubling. the stories of how they navigated that trajectory were incredibly empowering.
Thank you. Another question about in the workplace, extending to the workplace. How do initiatives like yours extend beyond the curriculum and classroom into the workplace during internships? Often the job descriptions for internships can be barriers for our neurodivergent students, especially during the interview process or the need for teamwork.
Yeah, it's another really good question. And it's a little tricky to respond because it's quite different for different professions. And the expectations for a medical professional versus a nursing graduate and OT vary quite a lot. And they also vary quite a lot depending on where they end up working. So there's quite a lot of different graduate settings to navigate. From an educator's point of view, the importance is to equip all of our graduates with that self-understanding and that ability to navigate those professional environments. But I think I'd also agree that there's a role for us to advocate for change in those professional spaces.
Another question is asking about, is any of this data public facing? I'd love to share this around. You did an amazing job describing the experience. It's like you put a mirror up to my experiences in uni and the workplace. I think there are quite a few comments actually on Slido of people really.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. I'm writing. I was up this morning kind of writing out a manuscript. It's not in the public domain yet, but we're working on it.
Okay, thank you. I'm just having a quick look through. There are lots of questions coming up. Are there any practical strategies that you particularly like for helping learners feel more comfortable being themselves?
And Jo, please feel free to jump in if there's anything that you want to add to the conversation. I'm aware that you're here as well. But on that one, I think those practical steps, part of it goes back to what I said initially about having the conversation about what we're actually asking students to be and who we're asking them to be. I mean, we heard so many stories of students feeling ashamed for doing things that seemed quite trivial, but were catastrophized, I suppose, in some ways, like fiddling with a necklace, which I do all of the time, or sitting with their legs crossed in a lecture theatre. Things like that, being called out as being unprofessional or inappropriate doesn't set a good tone. I mean, I think that happens a lot. It's trickier in a clinical context because there are some codified ways of behaving and appearing, but even in that space, I think the more that we talk about it and the more that we question it, the more that we break down some of those assumptions that really don't need to be assumptions.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Joanna. Visual description, I'm an Asian woman approaching middle age. I don't think I'm quite there yet. And I'm wearing a yellow mustard knitted jumper today because it's cold. I've got a few on the practical strategies front. I was just thinking about how professional identity and who we hope learners to become is also like a social construction. And one of the things that might be helpful is to actually have that conversation about what do we think people in this profession should be like, should act like? Have we noticed, you know, who are your role models? I know there's a bit of chat going on about role models and who we might have identified in various places that could act as a role model of how people might want to behave. And I think there's in that kind of conversation, there needs to be a place for understanding that there is going to be diversity and variation, and people might still be doing this particular job, but that doesn't mean that everyone has to be cookie cutter the same in how they act, how they speak, how they dress. And I think things are evolving. This is my Pollyanna view. I think back to when I studied medicine and expectations for dress and presentation, and all of that, and how much has changed over the past 20 years. And I think, as we continue to advocate and be in spaces and talk about this stuff, there's more opportunity for everyone's expectations to change about what professional behaviour might look like. And just back to the thing about the APRA registration, when I register for APRA, all I have to do is tick a box saying well, answer the question, do I have any conditions which may impact upon my ability to practice safely? That is the question that we're asked in the registration process, which is a little bit different to what universities might ask students to declare about. And there are all sorts of sort of, tensions there about disclosing to gain access to accommodations, and who that information goes to, and how that information is disclosed, if something is disclosed about the condition, versus what adjustments might be helpful for that person to learn. So I think there's a sort of a very fraught relationship there between, and perhaps more clarity is needed about who gets which information and what the purpose of any disclosure might be. So, and I see Elizabeth said, do you say yes or no? It's a very big dilemma. And I think the thing under that description of, when should you say yes or no, is really about, have you got a strategy for managing that thing? So, yeah, if it's not impacting you, you don't have to disclose because of the way that you're managing that.
Okay, thank you so much, both Laura and Joe. That was really, really interesting, and it gives me hope, thinking actually how much things have changed in the last 20 years, that things will continue to improve, and that the health care professionals who are coming through university now will have more opportunities to be their real selves. So thank you so much. Thanks to everyone on Zoom for your questions and time, and thank you to everyone in the room. We've got